right. Welcome to our Lighter Footprints meeting. This is a book launch. I think it's possibly our first book launch. Woohoo! And we are grateful for meeting here on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. And again, the way in which we are able to learn so much by acknowledging and understanding some of the learnings that are being passed down through their generations and from which we're able to benefit. So we're here today to launch a book, and we're very fortunate to be able to have a panel that you see in front of you who will be introduced to you in due course. The attempt to purchase books is one of the reasons for this. We have a number of books at the back of the room, which we're selling to you at discount price. And we are hoping that in the course of the evening tonight that you will buy one, and that Claire will be able to sign it for you if you'd like that. I'm not going to waste much more time. The evening is shaped in terms of the panel discussion. In fact, I'm going to hand over to the MC for the night. I'll stop trying to talk to you myself. I'll hand over to Victoria McKenzie-McHarg, whom I don't think is a stranger to anyone in the room, but who has done a great deal of good works with us over the years, and who is now the Strategic Director of the Women's Environment Leadership of Australia, WELA, a group that you really should find out a bit more about at another time, not tonight. Please welcome Victoria McKenzie-McHarg.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. It's really lovely to be back here with the Lighter Footprints family again and see so many familiar faces. It's a group I love engaging with, and in many ways, the lessons that I've learnt working with some of you over the last several years are lessons I saw reflected in this book. So it'll be really fun to explore a bit more of that today. Before we have the honour of launching this book here with Claire O'Rourke, I would first like to hand to our guest speaker tonight, Jono La Nauze. Jono and I also have a long history of working together. I actually first knew Jono when we were at high school together in Albury. We went to different schools, and I didn't actually know Jono. I knew his sister. Jono was her very scary older brother who had like these radical anti-Jabaluka stickers on his car. Oh my God. It was very edgy at the time, a terrifying character in my childhood. And then we met through activism and worked together at the Australian Conservation Foundation and then at the Climate Action Network of Australia. It's a real thrill and a privilege for us to have Jono here today, because Jono's gone on to become the CEO of Environment Victoria. And Environment Victoria is an organisation that is fully grounded in the diverse ways that communities take action for our environment. And their origin story came out of communities coming together over 50 years ago to fight to save the Little Desert in Western Victoria. And that was the birthplace, really, of the environment movement in Victoria. So it's a real honour to have Jono here with those stories and with that history and representation tonight. Jono, over to you.
Thank you. Can I do that? Is that a rush? Great. Thank you. And I'd like to pay my respects to the people of the Kulin Nation and any Aboriginal people here tonight. So Vic actually stole the start of my speech without realising it. We did go to school in the same town. My home was actually a little community called Splitters Creek, just outside of Albury-Wodonga. And it was this beautiful little valley with about 20 homes in it when we moved there when I was 2, many more now. And there were three institutions that kept that community together. The community water scheme that connected those first 20 homes to the Murray so that we could grow veggies and fruit trees and have green lawns in summer. The volunteer fire brigade that saved my home when I was a kid from a bushfire. And the horse riding club that was run by this World War II veteran who taught us all to ride and taught us the trails through the bush around the outside of Albury and through the mountains. Really active members, both in those institutions, but also in a broader movement for social change. I barely realised it at the time, but our family social life was often built around meetings and events of the local women's collective that my mum was involved in, fighting for women's reproductive rights and access to education. My dad was often away, busy with the Fred Hollows Foundation and increasing Aboriginal access to health. I know not now that not all of that work was easy, but at the time, as a kid, the abiding feeling that I had was one of love and connection between all those people. In particular, the energy and the courage that those women in the Albury Wodonga Women's Collective had, that they gave each other in this conservative rural town to fight for justice, was quite extraordinary. It's probably no coincidence that amongst those women was Cathy McGowan, and a bunch of women who also then went on and joined her campaign as part of that whole Voices for Indi movement that changed the Australian political landscape in a wave that, of course, then broke here in Kooyong and in May, thanks to many of you, I'm sure, in this room tonight. So before I go on, can we have a round of applause for everyone that helped make 2022 the climate election? Thank you all for everything you've done. So back to my upbringing for a second. I'm so grateful to have been brought up in that place. It was nestled below Victoria's high country, just on the edge of the vast Murray floodplain. And I spent so much of my time exploring both the mountains and the rivers around there. And so much of it with groups of people who were committed to working together in one way or another for their community, whether it was for the water scheme or whether it was to actually fight for justice and a change in their society. That really joyous childhood came crashing down when my mum died, aged 49, of cancer. I'd just turned 18. It was orientation week, but instead of, going out on scav hunts and pub crawls in Carlton, I was back in Splitters Creek saying goodbye to my mum. She had a really good death at home with the family and her friends, who not just comforted her, but cocooned me and my sister and my dad in what was the worst time in our life. Mum was able to die at home, in part because we had the means and the connections to secure good care, good professional care at home. But it was also because of the strength of the community that she had been a part of, that she had built around her, and that my dad had built around us. There was this great team of people who helped every day, not just for the 6 months of her dying, but for many years afterwards, as my sister and my dad and I pieced our lives back together again. Took me a couple of years, but eventually I did get properly involved in that student life that I missed out then in Erwick. And to the surprise of absolutely none of my mum's friends, I got involved in environmental justice activism. The Yorta Yorta people, whose country was very close to where I grew up, were forming an alliance with green groups to fight for what is really the jewel in the crown of their country, the Barmah forest. I remember at a really early meeting, I was 20 years old, and a conservation veteran was there helping us sort of map out strategy. And he said, "It'll take you 10 years, but you'll win. You can win this." And he was right, almost to the day. In 2010, Barmah was declared a national park. The chainsaws and the cattle grazing were gone forever, and Yorta Yorta would be in charge of what happened in that place from that day forward. I learned lots of things in that campaign, many things that I won't recount tonight, but the thing that I learned the most is that extraordinary life-giving power of working with others to make change happen. a lesson that I've learned just time and time again. When I came to Environment Victoria about 4 years ago, we were preparing to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And as part of that, we were pulling together a film and a book documenting the people and the campaigns of those previous 5 decades. One thing that struck me at the time, I was brand new to the organisation, although I'd always admired it and worked alongside it, was that we didn't have to go very far to find the people who had those stories, because many of them still were active volunteers and donors in the Environment Victoria community. And that speaks, I think, to the connection and the sense of belonging that comes when you work together to protect our common good. I'm not aware of any moment in human history where that task has been more urgent. I probably don't need to tell a single one of you in this room that life on Earth is literally in peril right now. It's not a potential future threat. Our climate is already dangerous. There is already too much carbon in our atmosphere. And in a certain sense, it's getting worse. Global warming is accelerating. Sometime in the last decade, probably in the last 5 years or so, we actually started experiencing exponential warming. And that is terrifying. But in another really important sense, things are getting better because the pace of social and technological change are also accelerating. And for evidence, we needn't look any further than this room and this electorate and what happened in May. And the fact that I'm actually the stand-in for Monique Ryan tonight. This week, I actually met with David Southwick and James Newbury again, who are respectively the shadow energy and the shadow climate ministers in Victoria. Most of you will know that 12 years ago, their party were elected on a platform in part of decimating Victoria's wind industry, which is something they then set about doing with great effect in their fairly short-lived term in office between 2010 and 2014. 4 years ago, they still had a miserable climate and energy policy, which included, believe it or not, promising to build another gas or coal-fired power station in the state, despite the fact that no investor would go near it. But they were walloped for that stance, absolutely walloped, something that the party elders openly admitted that night on election night, which coincidentally was the night I stood in the Environment Victoria election party back in the back of the room and signed my employment contract. I don't know what would have happened if the result turned out differently, but now I'm not here to tell you that the coalition, the state coalition, or the state Labor government for that matter, are going to take to the November's election, which is only 2 months away, the best climate policies in the world. But this is really important. What we are seeing right now is a serious attempt on both sides to compete for who's got better energy and climate policy, because they know that they cannot win office if they don't take voter concerns about climate change seriously. Just yesterday, Lily D'Ambrosio and Daniel Andrews announced the biggest energy storage target in the state. I actually had in my press release the first energy storage target in Australia, and I was talked down by Lily's advisors saying, oh, well, actually New South Wales got there first, but we're bigger. And it is truly actually a really significant precedent, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, we have become experts in Australia at harnessing the energy of the sun and the wind over the last decade or so. But to really make that available 24/7, we need to connect it with storage. And Victoria, we are lagging everywhere in the country on storage, but Victoria has now set the benchmark with ensuring, as they did 8 years ago with a renewable energy target, a storage target, that investment will flow into storage in the state. The Libs, on the other hand, have promised up to a million household batteries in the state, which is almost unbelievable. In fact, some energy experts will tell you that might be hard to achieve. But the fact is that they are competing and they are taking it really deadly seriously. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is we have passed a tipping point, a theme that I'm sure Claire is going to touch on shortly, a tipping point We had our climate election in Victoria. We had it 4 years ago. We are now in the race to the top phase, and it's truly exciting. We have not a minute to lose, but it's because of the energy of the people in this room and all around our state that we are in this position, and it's really exciting. That's kind of in part, I think, without stealing your thunder, what Claire's incredible book is about. It's a tearjerker at times, but most of all, it is this energizer for the soul. It fills you with hope and it sends you rocketing out the door to go and make change happen and keep making change happen. Claire, I first met when she and Victoria were part of my board, my boss at Climate Action Network. Claire has a long history of making incredible change happen, both in the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance as a union activist many years ago, at Essential Media, as the head of Solar Citizens, another great environmental and climate campaigning organisation, as the head of comms for the Every Australian Counts campaign, which led to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, one of Australia's great reforms, and now at the Sunrise Project and as a wonderful author. So I'm going to hand to Claire to relay to you the making of this incredible book. I thoroughly recommend it. Probably you've all read it, but if you have, you still have to go and buy another copy and give it to someone else, because we need to get the word out there and empower everyone else to do what I think a lot of you do every day, which is fight for change in a better world. I'm going to have to dash after this, sorry, because I'm racing to another really great event, the, what's it called again? Move Beyond Coal, the next big phase of the export coal campaign, which is a really exciting launch tonight. Sorry, it's happening at the same time, so I won't get to hear Claire and Victoria, but I have heard Claire's speech before and it's great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jono. I feel like I'm like just recovering from the emotional roller coaster that you've taken us on tonight. Thanks for coming. We won't be offended that you're going. It's fine. And thank you all for coming along tonight for the official Melbourne launch on NAM of Together We Can. It's been a bit of a whirlwind for me as a first-time author. You know, just in the last week, I've travelled from my home on Dharawal country, which is just south of Sydney, north of Wollongong in the northern Illawarra, over to Ghana country, to Adelaide, where we've had a series of events here and here again. So it's just a wonderful opportunity to reconnect and have long conversations with folks from all across our, you know, vibrant, diverse movement of climate activists and supporters. I had a wonderful couple of hours with a few of the folks from Lighter Footprints this afternoon. So it's just been a really excellent experience. But you're probably thinking, well, you know, what the hell am I doing here? Like, why have I done this and who am I? Because I am from up north, and folks, if you haven't been involved in Solar Citizens much, you probably don't know me. But before I go there, just wondering, how are you feeling about climate change? Yeah, there's usually a muttering, a few laughs, a bit, oh, don't really go there. But the fact is, you're not alone if you're feeling some of those more uncomfortable charged feelings about climate change. You know, we know from research that I've led at the Sunrise Project over the last couple of years that some of the more common feelings that people are experiencing are uncertainty, anxiety, frustration, grief, worry, sadness, and that's a purely rational and normal reaction to the state of the world. I think I have experienced, like possibly many of you here have, is what's scientifically known as a climate freakout moment. So I had my moment post kind of in the later stages of the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires, where we saw 1/5 of our eastern forests burn, billions of animals killed, people lost their lives and homes. And for me, I live in a place of relative security and, you know, great beauty, just kind of wedged between the beach and the Illawarra escarpment rainforest, which is usually very damp. You know, it's right at the moment, it's full of leeches, which is charming, fun. But this place is like suburban area surrounded by bush. It's very privileged. It's a gorgeous place to live. But during those fires, it was very dry, and we were told by the Rural Fire Service to pack up our homes. And it was when my youngest daughter, who was 13 at the time, was standing in tears while we were packing up the trailer. And I had this moment of incredible cognitive dissonance. How the hell was climate change hitting here right now? It was meant to be further away. I'd read the reports and I'd rationalized the science in my own head. I was driven and motivated to work on the cause. But it was that moment when I thought, wow, right here, right now, my home, my family, my child. And I, work with a whole bunch of really gritty, hardcore activists. There's one sitting on the stage here. There's folks sitting in the audience here, but also with my colleagues at the Sunrise Project. And I felt like, well, they're all getting on with it. I'll just cover it up and get on with it as well. But the fact is, I wasn't getting on with it. I was in a pit of grief, and I was really confronted by that. And it's something that I've heard so many people relate to as I've gone through the process of writing this book. And so I kind of tripped over this program called Good Grief. And it's a 10-step program, a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous for climate freaked out people. And you go to a session and you sit in circle and you go through and you assess your response to the state of the world, the fact that your life will end. It gets quite philosophical at times, has a bunch of self-care, but it led me to really reflect on my role at this time in this place, in this moment that we're in. And at the same time, we were doing a whole lot of research at Sunrise around attitudes to climate change. And I found that, well, actually, there's about 5 million Australians aged between 16 and 75 who are so worried about climate change, we call the category the alarmed. And I've also discovered through that research that people were mainly recycling in that category. Lots of recycling. Everyone in this room will know that recycling is really important to reduce waste, but it's also around 2 to 4% of our emissions problem in this country. When it came to some of the advocacy actions, the campaigning work, the lobbying, the systemic change work that people in this room would know better than many others are so important, the numbers drop down a long way. And I was thinking, why aren't people doing that? And one of the reasons is because they don't feel like it's easy for them to take part in this action. They feel like this issue is so hard and overwhelming. That's what our research said. And so I thought, well, there's something in this. Why are we not feeling motivated to take action? I know you are. I know I am. But why are we not feeling motivated? And I think the rationale I've come up with is that we are not feeling like we can, we're feeling like we need examples that show us impact, that show that people are making a difference day in, day out. And I knew from the position that I work in at Sunrise that I'm seeing a lot of positive action across all of the different states and many different areas of climate action, many different policy areas. And I thought, well, I've got a privileged position. If people want to come and talk to me about it, I can tell them a whole lot of stories. But I know that there's other things going on outside of Sunrise's work as well. So why don't I go and have a look? And when I went to have a look, I've found so many incredible things that are going on across all of our sectors in science, technology, climate tech startups, in the finance sector, in agriculture, in campaigning and advocacy and politics too. And there were so many stories, they just came together in a book. And that's the book that you've got in front of you today. We'll talk a little bit about lessons I learned later, that, I'm the granddaughter of a pro-life activist who was always engaged in her civic community. She was engaged in the local Progress Association. And while we had very different political views, I lived with her for my first year of university up in Sydney. And we would have these raging arguments all the time on the content, but we were highly engaged in what was going on. She always said, you should know who your local member of parliament is. You should always know what's happening in your community. You should always be connected. And when she passed away when my eldest daughter, who's now almost 18, when she was about 4 months old, and my grandmother said to me as she was dying, you got up on your soapbox and I got up on mine, but at least you got up. And it was a big lesson for me. So I'm rambling around a little bit, but the biggest thing I think I've learned through this process is that now is not a moment for heroes. You know, their heroes are kind of idolized in the press. We see the technologists and we see the financiers and we see the politicians, you know, fighting it out on the TV. And sometimes it feels like that's somebody else's job to go and fix the world. And what I've really learned is that heroes are everybody, potentially. And I've also learned that that step into action and that leadership journey that we'll talk a little bit more about tonight is something that's there for all of us to engage in. And I think groups like Lighter Footprints are one of the best examples of that journey over a long period of time, delivering outstanding, game-changing, nation-changing impact. And I think I might leave it there, but thank you very much for coming. I'm feeling like this is the end of kind of round 2 of a lot of touring this book around, and I'm just so grateful for the experience of being able to listen to people's stories, capture them in one place, and share them with you. And I hope you find them motivating, inspiring, maybe, you know, temper some of the climate freak out you might experience from time to time. And I hope it will motivate you to think about what you will do next. Thanks.
Claire, thank you. And a huge congratulations on the book. I mean, I feel like there needed to be like a ribbon or something that we needed to officially launched in Baldwin North.
Smash a bottle of champagne over the side of the book.
That's it. That's the only piece I feel we're missing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been a real joy to read, and myself, you know, you mentioned we've worked together for many years and have seen so many different bits of campaigns, bits of action. You catch the snippets, you sort of feel like you're catching it all. I've got to say, I was surprised picking it up. I did have, frankly, a little bit of an attitude of, oh yeah, I'm going to know a few of these. And was really surprised at the breadth of stories and actions in here, and turning the page and go, I better follow that group up. It's really interesting. And how did you approach this storytelling piece? Because it is so broad, it's so big. How did you start? How did you get into what has become a great collection of motivation?
I don't really know. I started working up this idea and then, you know, managed to get a book contract in July last year. And that was just, I don't want to talk about lockdowns too much because I'm from the north, but we did go into
out of the room.
We went into our second really long lockdown of 4 months. And so it kind of coincided quite nicely to be able to write and interview during that period, because, you know, what it's like on the weekend in lockdown, it's that or Netflix or, you know, arguing with your teenagers about getting out of their bedrooms for 10 minutes. So, yeah, I think I started just looking around at what I was interested in. And it was it kind of seemed like a bit of a meandering journey at times, because, you know, journalism teaches you to kind of follow your nose. And so I did do that. I just kind of would go, what about this sector? Who's doing interesting things here? And kind of exploring my networks. And so I think what was really interesting about that was some of the more unusual stories that were uncovered through that journey. And one that really sticks in my mind was a wonderful conversation I had with a man called Alistair McLeod. So he's actually Rupert Murdoch's son-in-law, and he ran News Limited in Australia for about 20 years. And he was running News Limited in Australia when I was also meandering around their head office, because I was organising the journalists as a union organiser on the shop floor. And I was zooming to his home in Oxfordshire and just waiting for the connection to land, thinking, am I going to have anything in common with this guy? You know, really? And within about 5 minutes, we certainly found loads of commonality, because Alistair McLeod is on a mission to prove that regenerative agriculture can be done at scale and be profitable as an industry. And he's got 3, you know, cattle trading properties up in the New England area in New South Wales. And last year landed a $500,000 offsets deal with Microsoft because they've been able to make calculations based on the improvements in soil carbon that have happened at the Wilmot Cattle Company's properties. So like, and you're in this conversation going, how am I in a conversation with Rift Murdoch's son-in-law? Like, you know, in what universe does that actually happen? And so it's super exciting, you know, being able to interview, you know, Matt Keane, the, you know, Treasurer and Climate and Energy Minister in the New South Wales government, where he's really happy to talk to me and tell me his story, because his story was growing up on the leafy North Shore of Sydney. And because his parents couldn't afford expensive holidays, they would go camping and hiking in national parks. He lived very close to the Lane Cove River National Park. And so he's grown up in nature and connected to nature. And a lot of people don't know a lot about that part of his story. And he was extremely candid about how he had the experience of going over to a hydrogen conference in that summer of, you know, the fires hitting, the Black Summer fires. And he saw the economic opportunity that was in front of us as a nation and got really excited about it. Also got shown up by almost every other country on Australia not stepping into that space, that hydrogen space. But when he arrived back in Sydney, he arrived pretty much at the time when the Sydney CBD, its air quality was 11 times hazardous levels. And he got up at a conference that the Smart Energy Council ran, and he said, this is climate change. And it was so controversial. And so these game-changing moments that are infused by people's stories, we don't often hear a lot about the backstory that folks have. If they're in the public eye in those kind of highly contested roles, it's always about the last pitch of the news cycle. Equally, we don't hear a lot about people working really quietly in the background who are doing their own thing, connecting communities, you know, leading communities, because it's not sexy enough for the headline news. The news that we see is all fight, outrage, the kind of, you know, the kinds of stories that are meant to kind of activate our fight or flight responses in our brains, because they agitate us. That's what makes us click on them when we see them on the internet. So I just kind of followed my nose, looked at what I was interested in, and I hope folks get a sense of kind of what was floating around in my head for the 12 months up until the book was launched. But yeah, there's plenty more stories where, you know, these ones came from. This is really the tip of the iceberg, to pardon the climate pun.
It's interesting to hear you frame it around the power of stories. Just hearing Jono and you speak, and both of you commented on your family history of activism, whether it be activism you support and engage with or otherwise. But and as you were saying it, I was reflecting on my own stories of and my nan's history in the young Labor movement, having grown up in Richmond during the Depression, and what that shaped, how that shaped her, and then shaped the stories I grew up with, and the identity of being able to create change, an identity that is somewhat empowered because of the stories we grew up with, and how this book becomes in some way an expansion of that and a really empowering tool for people who perhaps have not had those stories in their personal life and are looking for somewhere to embed. What's been the reaction of people reading the book and picking up on those stories? How have those reactions been shared with you?
So far, people have just found that, like, the refreshingness of it being positive, you know. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I was on a weekend away with my daughters between some periods of lockdown, and I was standing in front of a whole wall of books at an independent bookshop in the Southern Highlands, and just looking at them all, including one that's titled Climate Change Will Kill You. And I just was like, I just felt this weight. Like, they're really important books, these books. They, you know, they're about telling the truth, about accountability for decision makers. Those things are very, very important. But I just felt like I couldn't bring myself to engage in them because I'm engaging in a lot of quite hard stuff every day in my work. And I just think people are telling me that the stories are relatable. They're just ordinary, you know, everyday people. They're relatable stories. They're easy to absorb. They're not like, it's not too intellectual to read. It's a very page-turning kind of reading a good kind of comfortable magazine article. But people are also telling me that it feels like there's potential. Yeah. because there's potential in everyone to kind of claim their agency and, you know, kind of enact their own leadership. And I think people are getting ideas about what they could engage in.
It's interesting you say people have commented it is an easy read. It is an easy read. And I got 2 pages in and went, oh yeah, I remember she was a journalist. Oh, she does write well. Yeah, this is really forgotten that about you. And so that was really lovely. So you followed your journalistic experience and you brought your history and your skill set to the task. You explored the stories, but this is a familiar pathway to you. What did you learn? Not just what did you discover in the stories, what did you learn in that process? And importantly, what surprised you?
So I think one of the kind of failures we have as, you know, day in, day out professional paid activists is that we can be really judgy about what's the best kind of activism. And I think that manifests in other ways when you're a really committed environmentalist and you're doing everything you can in your own life. You see other people not washing out their plastic bags or, you know, those types of things, and it can completely drive you crazy. And, you know, but I think we can be super judgy. And in a kind of advocacy and campaigning sense, we're always looking for the best possible use of our resources to leverage the power so people can, you know, make the change that they want to. And so sometimes if the pathway seems too slow or slightly indirect, that can be somewhat frustrating. But I think what I've really learned through this process is that, you know, everybody has to walk their own path. And some of the social research suggests that if people are taking part in their own private personal environmental behaviours, like lots of recycling, there's something called the spillover effect, where people are, you know, more likely to take part in more public advocacy and campaigning related behaviours if they are like getting more and more engaged in those, you know, private environmental actions. So that was a big lesson, that there's different pathways. So, you know, I write about Lily Spencer, who lives in Melbourne, Lily Dempster, who lives in Melbourne, and she's created an app called One Small Step, where you can, you know, do your own personal sustainability challenges, and it reminds you, it's like an exercise program for climate stuff. And there's a series of challenges you can take part in. So it's very personal behaviour. If everyone does it, great, we get scale, but also it helps people get onto that behavioural pathway. Incidentally, One Small Step has just released a feature where you can set up groups, so you can have group collective challenges where you can measure the carbon reduction that you're rolling out through your group efforts, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so that was one big lesson, was learning and kind of having, I think, more respect and openness to different paces of change. Because sometimes I think we're so anxious as campaigners and advocates to move really fast because the challenge is so fast that sometimes we can end up, you know, that can be too fast and it can have like rebound effects we don't want. The other really big lesson I learned was about the power of how information spreads versus how behaviour change spreads. And a lot of people, particularly people in that alarmed category, as we found in our research, one of the biggest barriers for folks taking action is that they say they're not a good speaker or writer. So they feel like they need to be Oprah or Sir David Attenborough to be able to talk competently and confidently about climate change. And it is true.
I feel that. Yeah.
You've got it.
Yeah.
You've got it though.
Yeah.
You see how intimidating that is when someone's got it. But, you know, so that, yes, if you want information change to spread quickly, if you want information to spread quickly, it's really good to have someone with a big megaphone. You know, so yes, Oprah's handy. So is David Attenborough. That's really useful. We've done really well at telling people there is a problem on climate change. Really, really well. But if you want behaviour change to spread quickly, the work of social researchers like Damon Santola is actually about the power within networks. So behaviour change will happen in a network when you've got new social norms created as more and more people pick up the behaviours. But behavioural change will spread really, really fast when you've got a set of people in one network, often on the periphery, that's well connected to, and they're also in another network, so they're well connected to another network. So I used to think that if you kept seeing the same people floating in and out of different circles you were in, it was like, you know, it's just the same people all the time. But no, there's actually power in having these overlapping relationships and sets of networks, because that's how behaviour change can spread. So that was probably one of the more surprising things that I learned through writing a book.
It's lovely thinking about those overlaps. I mean, it almost tells the story of social fabric, doesn't it? You've woven together different groups and networks. Yeah, thank you. I really like that story. I'm wondering what your questions are for Claire. I don't want to hog her here myself. And I will open it up to the floor. I'll open to a show of hands if anyone has questions. I can go on all day, but I would love to know what your questions are. Yes, please.
It's called Together We Can. And there's about 100 copies up the back that you can engage in if you like.
There will be plenty of time for you to make a purchase for you, your cousin, your friends, your aunts. We absolutely have time built in for all of that towards the end. Any other questions in the audience?
Do you cover the effect of insecticide on our insects and then, of course, the broader environment?
I don't really. The story is actually much more focused on stories of people. So touches a little bit on it in the regenerative agriculture space, because what's interesting about the Wilmot Cattle Company is that they've managed to make a profitable cattle trading business by dramatically reducing inputs in terms of fertilizer and pesticides. So the pesticide, they do use a little bit of pesticides on their blackberries, but they've managed to go close to organic through that for a commercial operation, which is interesting. Absolutely, yeah.
Hello. No, it's a great point, and I think there's absolutely those different stories of empowerment and enactment in all the different ways are absolutely stories to be sharing. So thank you. Next question.
Hello. I was wondering if there was a commonality you found in how people brought people with them who perhaps weren't on the journey yet.
I could tell the story of kind of self-discovery that's led to that. So in Kingaroy, which is, a couple of 100 k's west of Brisbane, I was introduced to Suzanne Mungle, and Suzanne's a speech pathologist, mother of 4, and she went through quite a remarkable transformation from only knowing she didn't know any hippies ever, except for the people she saw in the shops with the crystals. She went from that to being a full-blown climate activist in about an 18-month period. And so there were these creeping changes that kind of set the context for that. Like her son was waging a war on waste. So thank you, Craig Rucastle, and your work with the ABC, because, he was doing that at his local primary school. And, she got talking to his teacher who was a vegan, and, she started thinking about that. She started studying a master's in public health, where she was, of course, and rightly exposed to all of the science. But still, it hadn't really landed for her until Greta Thunberg's speech at the UN in 2019, where, she felt that Greta was pointing her finger at her. And she just had her moment of realization and had an emotional crash and was, really emotionally affected for a couple of months. And, she's a smart, well-educated, capable, bubbly, outgoing kind of person. And so she did all the self-care things you do, like, journaled and listened to podcasts and got regular exercise, but, still found herself really overwrought by it. And there's just this one moment where she got up one morning and wrote in her journal, "I'm really sick of this." And this is how she said it to me. "I'm really sick of this. I'm going to do something about this." And so she started doing things and totally jumped in. She started an ordinary Eco Mums Facebook group. She's lobbying the South Burnett Regional Council, and she's had hundreds of conversations as a facilitator for Climate for Change. And that is how she is starting to have an outsized impact, because she's starting to create and leverage networks. She's starting to teach people. She's listening to people's stories and having those conversations. But it's kind of so interesting that people, and a common thing across a lot of the stories and the people I spoke to in the book, that just, they had this moment of, not just moment of realization, because when you have your moment of realization, you'll usually have an emotional kind of challenge or crash. But it's the moment where I am going to step into this and I make that decision and I'm claiming that agency, and I am stepping into a form of leadership that is right for that person. And that was very common across a lot of the people that I spoke to. In terms of the age group,
The
the book-
age group, yes, yes. You know, given the fact that young children are very interested in the environment, and particularly at secondary school, they're often extremely proactive. So I'm just wondering, in general, what do you suggest? And do you think it's a suitable book to be used in schools too?
yeah, I think it is a suitable book to be used in schools. In terms of the age group that might be interested, it's an easy read, so it's kind of all ages. If you fall into that alarmed category, is probably the type of person who's really worried about climate change, has done a couple of things, but might be thinking about they can't do too much, or it's too overwhelming, or they're too busy. So I was writing for that kind of person who felt like they didn't know how they could make a start, or how they could make a really meaningful difference on climate, where they felt like they were delivering impact. So that's kind of who I wrote it for, but I'm finding people of all ages are picking it up. Yeah.
Did the people who shared their story have the right of review, and how did that go for you?
Surprisingly well, actually. I interviewed 75 people for the book, and everyone who got more than just like a phrase, I sent them the draft and they were able to comment and make suggestions. Yeah, it was usually about tweaks of, you know, facts or name spellings and things like that. It was because the stories were very much told from their perspective and their story. It was an exercise in listening and pulling that together in a way that would be coherent for a reader to, you know, travel with.
Claire, thank you for a great book.
Thanks for yours, John.
Thank you. Your book's full of all sorts of fantastic stories and examples about what needs to happen. And I'm thinking too about the speed with which change still needs to happen. So given all of the possibilities and all of the things that need to happen over the next 4 or 5 years, when you're asked, what are the couple of most important levers, most important doors to open to really accelerate action from here on, what's your reflections on that question?
The energy sector moves so quickly that anything I say today will probably be out of date by Monday. We've just had Queensland release its energy plan today, which is game changing, 70% renewables target, and probably all coal-fired power stations in the state close by around 2035. Not quite what's required, but some of those power stations were expected to close by the energy market operator in 2050, 2051. And it's just, hang on, Queensland was the state that was furthest behind last week. So it is a really fast moving space. I actually think, and certainly the research that we've done shows that the most pressing concern about 2 or 3 years ago for people were jobs. Unsurprisingly, at the moment, it's cost of living. And I think we have a brilliant opportunity to electrify households, get off gas, and ensure kind of energy, as much as possible, distributed energy independence. So like small scale solar installations, batteries, electric vehicles, that type of energy independence that will help us, smooth the transition as much as save people money in the long run. And I think it's also the best way we can, I should say, insulate, because that's an energy efficient thing to do, insulate against potential divisive attacks on energy policy and, good renewables policy, because people who are most open to the next round of the culture wars on climate, if that you can see it kind of happening again, will be around the costs and cost of living impacts of the energy transition, the cost on bills, the costs on everything. You might remember some of those lines from Tony Abbott a bunch of years ago. So I actually think we've got a brilliant opportunity to secure energy independence and lower bills, but also fend off or insulate against any potential attacks around climate and energy policy. But that electrification agenda needs to happen really quickly for that to happen, for that to take place. And I think, but in that, what we need to also be super mindful of is that, there is already inequality in this country that's really problematic. And one of the stories I write about in the book is a group called Voices for Power, which is active on energy policy, but also community rights and community engagement about electricity awareness and bill awareness, because they work out in Western Sydney, where half of Sydney's population lives, and where in summer, on average, temperatures are 10 degrees hotter than they are in the eastern suburbs that are like wealthier. And so folks in Western Sydney are going to be less likely to be the first movers to do self-supported electrification measures, but they're also going to be worst impacted by rising electricity bills. So there's kind of an opportunity, and it's those folks, so they're often in, important marginal electorates that could easily be, the next round of folks that, climate deniers choose to try and weaponize against a good, progressive, sensible, transition policy agenda.
We have one last question that we're going to take, and I can see there's one or two other hands that are up, and I can assure you Claire's hanging around. So after you purchase your book at the back of the room at the end of this session, you'll be able to have a fabulous chat with Claire as she signs it for you. But before we move to that, over to our last question.
What role did First Nations people play in writing your book?
I certainly featured there's a few ways I tried to pay respect. First was every location in the book, I, as best as possible, tried to represent the traditional land that they were on and put that all the way through the book. I had some really fundamental conversations that are key to the big lessons I had from the book as well. So one was with a cultural linguist called Nola Turner-Jensen, and she's in the chapter around how we're craving connection, and she took me through on a series of conversations through what's called Skyworld Totemic Ancestry, and she provided me not only with some lessons, but gave me and all of us permission to engage in First Nations approaches to totems, as thinking about being connected to the natural world. Because when she sees one of her totems, which is the sugar ant, she's a Wiradjuri woman, she will go, oh, there's an ancestor. And so if you think about relating to animals and plants in that way, and you automatically start taking responsibility for them. And it's kind of a slight reorientation in your thought process on how we, most of us come from a colonial background, how we think about our relationship with nature. It's about being part of it, obviously, but actually active connection. And then there was a wonderful story with SOBA, which is the First Nations owned non-alcoholic beer company, which is kind of like, that's an interesting kind of company to put in a book like this, except they're doing a whole lot of sustainability measures as part of their business, but their whole business is founded and run on a principle, which is do less harm and do more good. And it's just a 3-second thought process and shift that, Gamilaroi man, Clinton Schultz, who's the founder of the business, says runs through every decision that he makes in his life and every decision that the business makes. And it just makes you think, imagine if that was at the core of every decision a CEO was making, or a politician was making, or one of us was making in our daily lives. So it was, some of those lessons were core, and I had a whole lot of other stories I was pursuing on First Nations progress and change and, land engagement and things. I just didn't have the time, and it would have been disrespectful to represent those stories without talking to those people firsthand. So I didn't make it this time, maybe volume 2.
Claire, do you have a totem now?
Well, you have to read in the book about my emerging, relationship with birds, but king parrots are pretty close to my heart because,
And the very final question, I said it was the final question. It was the final one of your questions. It's the privilege of getting to sit up here. You said you started this process kick-started by grief, like a shocking wave of climate grief. How are you now?
I'm fine now. No, I'm not really fine. I think if we don't grieve, it means we've never loved anything. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say so, but it's true. And I still have waves of anxiety and overwhelm and grief, and they're entirely normal. And I kind of treat them as familiar friends, those feelings now, because I know that those feelings are the things that some of the feelings that help fuel my work and help keep me motivated.
Thank you for your honesty in that. Thank you for the honesty that drove this book and the personal dedication and time you put into exploring these stories and gathering them you describe it as or it is described here as a love letter to the climate movement. It certainly is an empowering read, something I was inspired by, and I strongly encourage you to get yourselves a copy. Or to the people in your family, in your life, in your friendship network who need that hit of motivation to take their step, who are looking for those stories that motivate and drive them. This is the story that could well be their connection. So I encourage you to head to the back of the room when we're done here. But to wrap us up, I will hand back to Carolyn.
And I want to thank both Jono and Victoria for the way in which they've been able to reveal Claire to us and the work of this book. It takes some skill to be able to provide ongoing interest in the life and the expectation that a book is going to appear and you'll be able to understand what it's all about, all in like less than an hour. And I think you will agree with me that we've been really fortunate to have Jono's stories, to have Victoria with her stories and her capacity to provide us with insight into Claire. And of course, then we had Claire able to give us an insight into this book and the way that she's thought about it in such a fabulous way. So I just want to thank them personally, and I hope that you feel like me, that we've had a special evening tonight and that you will buy the book, not just for yourselves, but for somebody else that you've already identified needs it. You will have that opportunity now. At the back of the room, we've got the books. As we said, we've only got half an hour to do this. Hopefully there'll be a table on the way out at the end of our second session tonight. But between now and 7:30 is your time to buy the book and talk to Claire and have them signed. The next session from Lighter Footprints is going to be on the forests and gas related to the state election. Going to be a great night. So hopefully you'll be able to, some of you will stay for that. We've got a lot of food provided because we knew some of you might be a little bit on the hungry side. So get yourselves food and drink, as well as buying a book, and together with me, thank this panel. It's been a great night. Victoria, Claire and Jono. Thanks again.